E ngā mana, e ngā reo, e ngā rangatiratanga. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. I have just formally welcomed you in Māori, which is the indigenous language of Aotearoa, New Zealand, my birth country. And this greeting honours the mana, or the spiritual power of women, and also the leadership, the chieftainship, rangatira. So no pressure, everybody, but you can tell what's coming. I'm absolutely thrilled to moderate such an extraordinary panel of Boardroom sisters. My name is Amanda Ellis, and I lead global partnerships at the ASU Julianne Wrigley Global Futures Laboratory, based in Phoenix, Arizona. But you can see the tartan. I just found out my great-grandfather is from Dumbarton, just down the road, so I have Scottish ancestry. I wanted to first to introduce all of our panelists very briefly, then I'm going to ask them to say one thing about themselves of interest to them. It could be professional, could be personal. We're then going to go through a couple of moderated rounds of questions and finish with a call to action. So on my right, I have the amazing AIMÉE Christensen, who is the CEO of Christensen Global. And as you will hear when we start to get further into conversation, she really should be 150. She has been an advisor to so many incredible firms, including Google, and she also sits on the board of the Julianne Wrigley Global Institute of Sustainability, which was the first in the world, founded back in 2003. Now I have to get everybody's names right. SEEMA JOSHI, who is the Director of Campaigns for Global Witness. Welcome, it's wonderful to meet you. And we have MUKWANDI CHIBESAKUNDA, take it right, who is with us all the way from Zambia and has a number of very interesting firsts to her name. Tamsin Jones from the Rallying Cry, Katie Hoffman, who, you've done so many things, Katie, but I guess it's Regeneration VC now, and Ethno Capital. And Maja GROFF, who is the convener and chair of the Global Climate Governance Commission. So, an incredible pleasure to have these wonderful women with us. I'm going to ask you each, we're going to run down this way and then run back this way, to just tell me one thing about your work, why Boardroom Sisters are so important, and one thing that's really important to you, either personally or professionally, in regards to this notion of Boardroom Sisters. Do you want me to start with Maja? Yes. Okay, start with Maja. And tell us a little bit about your background at the same time. So what is it that has inspired you to be engaged in this area of governance and women on boards? Is that easier?
Yeah, it's easier. I could start there. Okay, fair enough. So it's a bit of a personal and professional first. Is my mic making noise? Personal and professional, I actually fell in love traveling to Mexico when I was starting at 9 years old, and I fell in love with the Mayan culture and their way of engaging with nature and each other, and it really led to my whole career. I ended up majoring in Latin American studies and anthropology to understand a better way of engaging with the world. I graduated from college in 1991, to give you a sense. It was before Rio, before the word sustainable development was just being coined at that moment. And when it was coined, I realized that was what I wanted to work toward in my whole career, but inspired by the Mayans, and particularly Mayan women, who, when I was little there, would help teach me Spanish and their amazing foods and culture, and, as I said, just way of engaging with each other and supporting each other, and the multi-generational support system among women. So that's a little combination of the two.
Supporting each other and the multi-generational system. Fantastic. Thank you. SEEMA.
Thank you so much for the question. I don't know if this is on, but anyways. For me, I'm inspired to be involved as a director and also on boards because I want to change leadership. I think actually, I feel there's a real problem with leadership, and I mean, I was born in the 70s, grew up in the 80s, 90s, even to now, and actually, I think that the current state of the climate crisis where we're at is a complete demonstration of failed leadership globally. So, and I think that cuts across all sectors. I mean, I've worked in a law firm, I've worked at the UN, I've worked in the NGO sector. So I think across all sectors, there has been failed leadership. So for me, it's really important that sort of women in the boardrooms and accountability, it's absolutely essential if actually we want to change this leadership model and we want to get more accountability. So what inspires me is is fairness and accountability, and we have a responsibility to do what we can to save this planet.
Fantastic. A real responsibility to do what we can to save the planet. And we look at the data points. I apologize, I'm a boring old economist, so I'm going to give you data points all the way along. When we look at the percentage of women on boards in countries where there are not quotas, and we see how low it is, less than 1 in 5. And when we look at parliamentarians, it's just reached 1 in 5 in terms of governance. And yet the research shows us from both foreign policy and from the International Finance Corporation that where there are more women in leadership positions, both in parliaments and on boards, there is a greater attention to sustainability and to climate outcomes. So you could not be more on the money, SEEMA. Thank you very much. Mukwanda.
Thank you. I grew up as one of 6 girls. And this is in Zambia, Africa. And at that time, we always believed that a boy child was the child that would look after the family. And we grew up that way with my sisters, but we started questioning that narrative as we grew older, and we realized that actually things could be different. But I remember when I was growing up, I didn't have a lot of role models who were in the boardroom. And what this does is gives that opportunity for a sisterhood, for that partnership, to make it possible for others to grow and play a part in our community in a way that when we were growing up, it wasn't that obvious. And that's what gives me the determination to make a difference for other Zambian children, for other Zambian families, so that the girl child can know that actually they can make a difference through the boardroom and deal with the sustainability issues that we're facing.
And what a wonderful role model you are. Does anyone know who was the first to discover that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere created warming? Does anyone know if it was a woman or a man? It was a woman, yes, back in 1856, Eunice Newton-Foote. And for similar reasons as you've just described in Zambia, she really wasn't recognized. So it took people like Catherine Wilkinson and the wonderful book All We Can Save to highlight that often women's voices are not listened to and heard. So thank you so much. Tamsin.
It's great to be here. So I guess my board journey started when I was working across many different countries. Actually, I met MUKWANDI when I was working on the Africa list. And as we looked at whole economies and leaders across those economies, and the percentages of women, you could see that they weren't going necessarily from the executive into the boardroom. And it was a curiosity to me. And when I asked companies why, they said, because there's no women. And I was like, but I know them. What is this craziness? So we went and we mapped women across Africa. So we have about 1,500 women across 50 countries who we place on boards. But the fascination for me came when I asked them, well, how is your experience of that? Like, do you bring your full self into that space? Is it a creative environment? And it's kind of the opposite in many respects. And one of the comments I would get that really touched me is, I can't give up one more part of myself or I won't know who I am in this role. And so for me, the interest is how do you bring the feminine into that space, the not knowing, the possibility of a different future. So that's kind of where I come at this.
I love that. How do you bring the feminine, the notion of the feminine into that space? And it is fascinating too, because again, the research shows that 1/3 is the magic number. So if there's one woman on a board, often it's very difficult to feel brave enough to stand up and be counted. But once there's a critical mass, and they usually 1/3 or at least 3, makes a difference. So thank you for the incredible work you're doing in Africa. Katie, you are by far the youngest one here and have been doing many groundbreaking things, which I think we'll come back to next time, but tell us a little bit about your current involvement.
Well, first and foremost, I want to say that I thank you to the hosts and She Moves Climate. And Amanda, it's good to see you again. So many friends here. So I actually, the personal and the professional. So I'm 32, you mentioned that. And I spent about 1/3 of my life taking care of my mother who had very significant late stage ovarian cancer. And they said only 3 months to live. And then we kept going and we kept going, and our family came together and really worked to push for patient advocacy to protect her and to make sure that she was getting treatment, also holistic treatment. And spending 10 years caring for the person that created me really helped me get a little more systemic in my thinking as well, right? So I love my home. I love the person who created my home, and I also love the home we collectively share. And that actually was what gave me the courage to jump into the divest invest movement and try to shift trillions of dollars. And we actually were quite successful in doing that. And it was a movement that was diverse. It wasn't just women, but it was getting into the boardrooms and talking to, you know, the folks, the CIO of the University of California, working with senators across the state of California and saying, you know, it's your fiduciary obligation to integrate climate risk and the risk to our home into how you think about allocating across asset classes. And honestly, it was we'll talk about it a little bit later. It was quite a slog, but what gave me hope consistently was the fact that I believe that we're on the right side of this. All right, I believe it is our obligation to protect our home and also to ensure our assets are always in alignment with that.
And as Paul Pullman says, there's no business to be done on a dead planet. That's a wonderful segue to MAJA, because Katie, you referenced the importance of not only talking to boardrooms, but also to senators and legislators. And one of the interesting things in New Zealand, my home country, we are the first in the world to have passed mandatory climate disclosure in line with the TCFD. And Mark Carney's work with the climate-related task force on climate-related disclosures. So, and after that, the UK followed suit. Small coincidence that there was a woman CEO, is a woman CEO of the Treasury. So I think great to see that. And that's a wonderful segue to MAJA, who is the convener and chair of the Global Climate Governance Commission. So MAJA, you've written a fabulous book published by, am I going to say Oxford University Press, or is it Cambridge? Cambridge University Press, which also talks about some of the reforms that we should be making. Give us your personal perspective on this.
Journey. Thank you so much, Amanda. Lovely to be with everybody. So in terms of my personal journey, I was raised on North Vancouver Island in Canada in a place of amazing wilderness and ecological heritage, diversity. And my first role models were my mother and her friends, who showed this different type of leadership in this sort of community setting, as well as Indigenous people in that area. So now I've practiced international law in The Hague for over a decade, the past decade, and that has awakened my passion and hope in the transformative potential of international law, and which has brought me to this Climate Governance Commission, which I know is a lever, and perhaps the best lever, to protect these local environments, the biodiversity, also the cultural diversity. We need to think global. So in terms of also my journey in terms of thinking of corporate ethics, of gender parity on boards and corporate leadership, and the Climate Governance Commission, we deal a lot with the progressive corporate sector. For me, having gender parity across all corporate actors is absolutely imperative for the energy transition that we have to make for climate. We have to think in an interdependent way. And so this is fundamental to governance, really, and where corporations are also at this time governance actors at the global level, sometimes having more economic resources than many countries. Gender parity across corporations is completely fundamental, as well as, of course, in parliaments and at all levels of decision making.
Great. And it's wonderful to know that there is actually a very well proven gender dividend or diversity dividend. When I was lead economist at the World Bank for Gender many years ago, 20 years ago, there were not the data sets. And now we know that there's a 0.6% higher return on investment where there are significant numbers of women on boards. So it's actually a very positive business case, as well as being, of course, the right thing to do. I wanted to come now and ask AIMÉE. She's looking at me thinking, what's she going to ask me now? But AIMÉE, you were really instrumental in the first climate change agreement way back in 1994 between Costa Rica and the US. And I just wondered if you could tell us about that, a little bit of an insider's perspective, because you were really a pioneer way before this became fashionable.
Thank you, Amanda. It's funny, I was just sharing this story with James Cameron, who's the attorney who joined with the small island states to develop the first draft UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. It was the first draft that was brought to the gathering before Rio. And so we were talking about this. So when I was so inspired and fell in love with the Mayan culture in Latin America, I found myself at the Department of Energy in 1994. And I was working in the International Policy Office, and President Clinton said, I want to do a Summit of the Americas. I want to re-engage with Latin America. He'd just been elected. And I was asked to figure out what should we agree on Western Hemisphere-wide on energy. And so I proposed a chapter in a Western Hemisphere agreement among all 34 heads of state on sustainable energy, and that was in process and it was ultimately signed and then led to a lot of amazing collaboration throughout the hemisphere on clean energy and climate. Unfortunately, we had some elections since then that disrupted that amazing cooperation. But President Jose Maria Figueres showed up at the Department of Energy, had just been elected president. He was actually president-elect, and met with our leadership at the Department of Energy. And after the meeting, which I was not in because I was 25 years old, I was told, figure out what a bilateral agreement on climate change with Costa Rica would look like. And so I found myself on LexisNexis. There was no internet, learning about Costa Rica and clean energy and climate change. And that was April of 1994, and September of 1994, President Jose Maria Figueres and Al Gore signed the bilateral agreement on climate change. And the reason it came together is because the person on the other side of the table, of course, was Christiana Figueres. What was amazing is women, it was collaborative. It was what are our win-win goals? The US, our goal was, of course, we wanted to work on climate, but we also wanted to allow opportunities for our technologies and our investment to help finance their clean energy development. They were looking at building new dams. Well, dams release methane emissions, so that was counter to the climate. And so we ended up collaborating out of that agreement on their development of geothermal and wind to diversify away from just hydro, and also to protect their forests. We did the first, carbon trading projects, but actually finance the protection. When you do it right, it can help finance clean energy because it makes it more cost effective against the fossil fuel options, and it also protected their forests. But it was because of Christiana, and my boss at the time was Hazel O'Leary, the first woman Secretary of Energy, and she empowered me. She made sure that I remember, I'll tell you one quick other story about this time, because we were having a meeting between the Secretary of Energy and the Minister of Energy of Venezuela. We were allies then. We bought all their oil, and they loved selling it to us. And I came in last, and there were no spaces left at the table. And she said, Amy, sit in my chair. So I sat in her chair behind her desk. And then as we started the meeting, she turned after the initial kind of niceties, what do we want to do in this meeting? What are we trying to do together in the hemisphere? Amy, why don't you start us off? How do you think we should proceed? What are our priorities? So she turned to me and empowered me so that as I then, going forward in my job and working with the Latin American governments, they saw that she trusted me and would be turning to me for that guidance. And as 25, 26 years old, it was critical that I had that credibility as I ran around the Western Hemisphere and to move that forward. So, and I could also talk about women allies and male allies throughout my life. It's been vital throughout both. So.
Fantastic. Well, what a story. And I thought I knew Amy well, and I just heard another new story today. So fantastic. And I'm actually going to hop now to TAMSIN, because you were talking to us a little bit about some of the work that you were doing with leadership and inclusive innovation. And I'd love you to tell us a bit more about your Boardroom Africa program. I love this idea of women empowering others, and I know that that's what you've been doing with Boardroom Africa.
Yeah. So, the Boardroom Africa it started out as a bit of an accountability idea. People saying there's no women on boards, and you say there are, and it kind of, how do you prove that? And so it was nice to go into a private equity event and say, here we are, if you don't speak to us, you're not serious. So it had a sense of accountability, but what it turned into, I think, for us was a series of really candid conversations with women who had the potential and the capability to utterly change the business they were in, the context they were in, but they were feeling very constrained. You know, I need to be within these boundaries, I need to do it within this way, I'm the only one on the board, you know, how do we shift that? So it actually became, as much as anything, I think, you know, one of the other panelists said, I wish this was a circle and not a straight line. I think that's a great description of how women would generally choose to lead if they could. And so kind of coming out of that and working with Carrie and others on the rallying cry, it was like, well, how can we find the women who are the change makers who are saying, I do not want to sit in a room that knows the answer already. I'd prefer to create a different one, or find the companies that are willing to shift the boards. And I think if you want to know what a company's interest is, you have a look at their board. And that generally tells you really how far they want to go, who they're bringing in. Because if you don't understand your community or are willing to kind of come up with these new things. But I think when I was sitting and doing board recruitment, and I would say the key question to ask people coming in is it okay for you not to know the answer? And it's a really poignant question. And I think women are very good at that. They're very good at saying, in this circle, I play this role, but here's the question. And if we all come together in a collective intelligence way, what might happen? But that can be scary, right, depending on the company. But we don't want to work for the companies that are scared of that, you know. So that's been my experience. And I love bringing more emotion into the intelligence part. How do things feel? What do you sense into something, as well as what is the precise answer? Because I think women have intelligence in different ways that is much more intuitive. And so when I say the feminine, I mean all the things that everyone does to make decisions that they don't say they do. You know, how do you pick up on things as well as the data you can show, but, you know, just feeling in and sensing into things intelligently.
Beautiful, thank you. And I think, SEEMA, you too have been very engaged with this principle of the feminine in the boardroom. And just wondered if you would comment a little before we come to, gosh, you're so many firsts, MUKWANDI, so we're going to come to you for some practical advice. But SEEMA, tell us a little bit about your interpretation of the feminine in the boardroom. And it can often be really scary to actually ask questions. And I know there's a couple of studies that were done with women and male mid-interns, and the women were marked down because they asked more questions, which in fact is what they should be doing. So it's a tricky question sometimes.
I think it's a very tricky question. I mean, I think the truth is I mean, there are so many unconscious biases that are operating, I mean, on every level. So, I mean, if you're a woman and if you've gone to the boardroom, you've actually been able to overcome many unconscious biases that are probably negative and working against you, and with intersectional experiences that manifest in a very different way, right? So I think they're always there. The best thing I have experienced, I mean, I do think that even on a board where you can have 4 women and 1 man, somehow the man still gets equal attention according to 4 women's, attention would equate to the 1 man. So it's very interesting that it's not just about the numbers going up. I think that's a great indicator, a great numerical something we can put our finger on to basically say there's a shift. But I don't know, I don't think that and I'm really interested in what AIMÉE said because she's running her outfit, and I don't run mine. And the boards I've been on, I haven't run those. So I think that it's a values assessment that actually needs to happen as well. So. And the values assessment essentially is about, it's about collective decision making. I mean, there can still be hierarchy, I still believe that, but it's accountability and a collective decision. It's like a team that achieves, rather than maybe singling out a star player. Like, it's just these cultures that we have seen in the workplace. Those to me are indicators of real shifts. Women, reinforcing what other women have said. I remember once doing a speech or a talk, and this young student, or she'd started out her career, and she said, yeah, but I just feel that when I speak, it's really difficult to get traction. And I said, well, sometimes it's really great, like if there's another woman in the same meeting, have a conversation with her, and then make sure you affirm each other. So when you put up your hand, you say, I really liked what AIMÉE said, I'd really like to build on it, blah, blah, blah. Because actually you see a lot of men doing that. So it's kind of this joint allyship and dynamic. So
That's what the women in the White House, Obama's White House, there's a famous story about the women in the Obama White House doing that for each other.
yeah, I think that's really important. I do think that there should be accountability on boards. The last thing I wanted to say is the risk came up and risk assessments. And of course, if you look at boards, the whole risk management part of their role is extremely critical. And we have a real movement, at least here in, I do live in London in the UK, and let's say in the Western, I don't know, sort of these countries that, yes, we're diversity inclusion. We are diverse. We are inclusive in our work places. Like often you go to these websites, we are inclusive. This is their kind of purpose, and it's up there right under their purpose. We really need to have accountability around using terms like inclusivity and diversity, and really how is that actually functionally playing out in the workplace, and that's for the betterment of all employees in the workplace. And I think that we're really just at the beginning of understanding what that looks like. And I also fear, I mean, I would love to read your book. I think we're a far way in practical terms from being there currently.
Thank you for that great personal tip. So that's something that we can all take away in terms of supporting each other and doing that very deliberately. I once ran the women's program at Westpac Banking Corporation in Australia, and we realized that all of the male business bankers were male. And so to try and shift that, they brought in women and paired them together and had a deliberate strategy of having the women reinforce each other across different business units within the business banking group. And they found that at the end of 6 months, they'd all been promoted because of that mutual support and giving each other visibility. So I think it's a great strategy. The accountability piece is a really interesting one too, and setting targets, sometimes just KPIs. Westpac was the first bank, in fact, the first corporation in New Zealand to actually have 50-50 men and women on the board. And that was because they said, well, we're just going to do it. And we're going to set KPIs, and we're going to have 50-50 women in senior management. And this is going to be just like any other business target, because we know there is a diversity dividend. Thank you. And this is a lovely segue to MUKWANDI. You are the first woman CEO of the the Zambia Commercial Bank, and I know you've also been instrumental in banking right across the whole diversity of the spectrum, on the regulatory side and on the government side and on the commercial side. So tell us a little bit about your personal experience in breaking all of those barriers.
Thank you. I would agree that we have to be intentional about it, and it's a partnership. I'm a member of the Boardroom Africa. TAMSIN gave me that step up. And I've been a member of the Africa List. They gave me the confidence to go out there and do something. So along the way, you'll find that you have these angels who look after you, like what you were talking about, giving you a seat at the table. That's what it takes. And we should never underestimate what it means, because at that moment, you're then allowed to believe that it's possible. And I think that's what happened to me. That's how I became the first, after 52 years of the existence of this company, to be CEO. And even when I was appointed, people still came and asked me, are they serious? Have they really appointed a woman to run this big institution? Don't you think they'll change their minds? People would ask me that question directly. And so at the end of the day, what we need to be able to do is to work hard and prove ourselves. And we're constantly proving ourselves. We work twice, 3 times as hard as any man would, just to make sure that we are able to prove that actually we can do it. I hope that my daughter won't have to work twice as hard as her brothers, because by that time, the society will have accepted that actually a woman can be in the boardroom, or she can be anywhere else she wants to be, on the farm or wherever, because it's her right as 50% of the population to be where she wants to be. Now, for me to get to where I am today, I think we would need the whole afternoon to just talk about some of the experiences that I had. And to your point, men are also supportive. it's not just about the women who support us. We have a lot of men, both in terms of our bosses over the years, there are various bosses who saw the potential in me and gave me that opportunity. And even right now, I've got two of my team here with me, Sydney and Charlie. And I've been speaking, I think I've spoken at about 4 events in the last week or so, and they're there every time, supporting and taking pictures and posting. I told them, okay, stop posting. I think people are tired of seeing my pictures now. But that's what it's all about. It's a whole ecosystem of support to make it happen. It's not an easy thing. It's a lot of hard work, but I believe that together we can create that capacity to deliver.
Love it.
Thank
Love
you.
it. A whole ecosystem of support. And it's a beautiful segue to Katie, who's going to tell us the story about how she managed to work with CalPERS at a very young age and to really, well, I'm not going to tell the story. It's a story of transformation and radical collaboration. Katie.
Yeah. Well, I guess I must have been 18 or 19 years old, and we started doing some research at the University of California, which has a $130 billion portfolio, so it manages a lot of public institutions across California. And some of us students were looking into it. I went to Berkeley, which is up in Northern California, and we realized that there was no policy, nothing that had anything to do with fiduciary obligation around owning what has been, now discussed as the carbon budget or stranded assets, right? So fossil fuel companies with the largest carbon footprint, and there was a list of companies that we found across the portfolio, and we went to the boardrooms, right? We went to the office of the CIO, and it was a couple of students initially, and they said, buzz off. And then we brought our friends from RBC, some of our friends from the philanthropy world, and we built a pretty profound coalition, actually. And it took a little bit of time, but we were able to get the University of California and then eventually the state of California to implement policies that integrate ESG into their risk management strategies. And that's something that it would not have happened without other women, since we're bringing this up. So the Divest Invest Coalition, led by an amazing group of people, and chief of which is an amazing woman named Ellen Dorsey, who has been a mentor to me in many fronts from the Wallace Global Foundation. And we were able, not just in California, to pass some of these policies, but to create a grassroots movement that also empowered folks to talk to their state legislature, also folks within the boardroom of institutional investors and endowments, and get ESG into the conversation from a different angle, perhaps, right? That maybe would not have happened from the top down, but happened from the bottom up. And now I think it has helped accelerate the conversation around how we move trillions of dollars annually into the solutions that we need in order to address some of the crises and opportunities that we're facing. And right now, I think Divest Invest as a coalition internationally has 14 trillion in assets under management committed. And about $1 trillion of that is coming from California, and having students and young people lead a significant part of that and be a part of that was incredible. It also did lead me into wanting to build solutions from the ground up, so building financial vehicles and working in venture capital, which has enabled me to invest in solutions and startups that are hopefully can get along the line and be capable of taking some of the institutional capital that has been unlocked by movements like Divest Invest.
Awesome. Thank you. And from that kind of grassroots movement, we're going to pivot to Maya at the other end of the scale with global governance. And just a warning, I'm going to ask each of you to finish with one call to action for the audience. So just be thinking about that while Maya tells us about global governance and why it's so important to have a gender dimension.
Yes, I mean, many dimensions to that insight that parity is fundamental to addressing the climate challenge, the biodiversity challenge. And I do very much agree with this comment that really the climate crisis is a failure of leadership, our rigid leadership models that are hyper-competitive, that are male, that are a sort of very narrow sense of maleness and are not gender balanced. So the global governance level, I think the gender dimension must be included at all levels of governance in our societies, from local to global. And again, the corporate actors are so very fundamental. And projects like the Drawdown Project with Paul Hawken has said, the empowerment of women and girls is one of the top action areas for addressing the climate crisis. So why aren't we all singing this, shouting it from the rooftops in terms of the empowerment of women, again, at all levels is so completely fundamental. And yes, if you look at a G7 or G20 meeting, you see the unbelievably incredibly unbalanced governance there in terms of gender. So thinking about women and their empowerment, be it at the United Nations in terms of international peace and security, which I know you've been involved with, Amanda, at the International Court of Justice, in developing new legal institutions. We heard on the last panel mentioned ecocide. We've seen the most amazing women winning Nobel Peace Prizes for doing dramatic work to ban nuclear weapons, to ban landmines, etc. So I think all of this just shows what the research has borne out, that if you do have more women in parliament, more women in governments, they pass more progressive environmental laws, et cetera, et cetera. So for these intersecting ecological crises we're facing, women, empowering women, making sure there's gender parity, women and men working together is an exponential policy that we need to see at all levels and throughout the whole system.
Thank you. Love this notion of exponential. And I'm going to go first. 17% of boards are ESG and climate competent. Now, if we had 17% of people on the audit committee competent, we'd all be a little bit worried. So we have just joined forces with Oxford Business School, Thunderbird Global School of Management, and a woman-led business, Hella Bank-Jorgensen, who wrote the world's first green accounting standards when she was a partner at PwC. And we're now running something called Climate Competent Boards. So please all sign up. We want to, and spread the word, because we want as many people as possible becoming cognizant of this. So that's my call to action, is join climate and ESG competent boards. Amy, what's yours?
Well, first I just wanted to make a quick example of the male allies piece, if that's okay. I just think it's really important to recognize them when they're there and to value them. And it was at Google pushing for, so no one else, I mean, when we asked the question, could we go carbon neutral? It was a bit of a male boys club kind of assumption that what they were doing already was enough. And I really, really kind of put my body on the train tracks. And no, it was pretty, and there was a male in the room who was very powerful and said, okay, that's great, you guys, but how are we going there? And he just, kind of, so I just acknowledged that at that moment. And then advising the chairman of Duke Energy, biggest polluter on carbon, and he had board members who know the truth about climate change, and he had advisors who were male who knew the truth about climate change, and they just weren't demanding enough. And so I just called about, and he said, oh, you're a truth teller. So so my call to action is be a truth teller, raise your voice, and back up another woman in the room who's being a truth teller to be her ally.
Fantastic. Be a truth teller and back up another woman in the room. Fantastic. Seema, yours.
Sure. Mine was to call out climate greenwash. And to demand accountability. And I think that could be through many ways. So I just think, having sat through a lot of the sessions at the COP, and I think it can be very confusing for people to really understand what is the greenwash and what is actual meaningful action. And I was grateful for the lady who, on the earlier panel, referred to the Global Witness research on the 503 fossil fuel lobbyists at the COP. So do what you can to really sort out facts from fiction, call out the corporate climate greenwash.
Fantastic. And sort out facts from fiction. Excellent. MUKWANDI.
I just want to say that we're not victims. We're telling our story just so that it resonates with everyone to understand how far we have come. But at this point, we're not victims. We actually have the power to act. And that's why gender and climate change have been paired, because we can make a difference. And I think we need to just make sure that we actually do make that difference. And it's not us whining and just talking about, oh, it's been so difficult to get here. No, we are here and we can do something about it. Thank you.
Fantastic. Tamsin.
I think we need a kind of a revolution. We need transformative action. And if you are someone that wants transformative action, be in spaces that want it to. Look at the board structures, not just women, but diversity. How connected is a company to its ecosystem? Does it see its shareholders as more important or its stakeholders? Because we kind of only have one life, right? We want to invest our time and our energy into that. And I've seen what happens when you go into spaces that aren't wanting to transform. I'm not saying don't be activist, but I think there are much more feminine spaces that are asking these questions. So be really careful where you put your time. And if you want some indicators of that, look at the boardroom.
Thank you. Katie.
Yeah, I think that one of the most profound things, other than everything that's said and will be said, is know where your money sleeps. I mean, many of us have bank cards, right? We have bankers. We work within institutions as individuals or perhaps with our businesses. It's good to know where your money sleeps, who your bankers are. It would be great if they were women, but asking the right questions, right? How much is this bank financing new expansion of coal plants in particular regions? I mean, knowing those questions, that can come from, perhaps being in these circles, but I remember walking into a conversation with my banker and asking these types of questions and them not knowing, how much fossil fuels were on their balance sheet. And I think that if we're really moving into an era where we need to stop financing the destruction of our planet, all of us can participate by not banking and putting capital into those institutions that do it.
Awesome. Maya.
My call to action in this decade of action, this urgent time, perhaps the most important decade in human history, honestly, in terms of the climate crisis and what we're facing. And you see with corporations, many progressive corporations, there's an openness to really radical change and also greater collaboration. And my call to action is really to make gender parity and gender parity in leadership fundamental to this holistic systemic transition that we must enact, that we must together create. So that is my call to action within corporations, but all layers of governance to make gender parity and working together, men and women and diversity core to this whole transformation project.
What a beautiful place to end.